What do you think of when you look at pictures of the Boeing 707? It's maybe not as iconic as the 747 or as graceful as the Concorde, and it's not as impressive and groundbreaking as the Comet. But what the Boeing 707 definitely is very familiar. Because without a question, this aircraft and the Boeing 367-80 prototype to spawned it literally defined the shape of jet-powered commercial aviation as we know it. And it did that 70 years ago. Stay tuned. A few weeks back, I made a video where I took a closer look at the history of the de Havilland Comet, the world's first true jetliner, and all of the events that led up to its development. But as amazing and beautiful as that jet was, it didn't turn into the aircraft that became the blueprint for future commercial jet aviation. That title clearly belongs to Boeing 707, but the development of this aircraft and its subsequent influence in the industry definitely wasn't apparent from the start. Actually, quite the opposite. Early in August 1955, the Seafair Week Festival was taking place on Lake Washington in Seattle. This was and is a hugely popular event featuring, among other things, the Gold Cup hydroplane races, which traditionally draws quite a large crowd. Back in 1955, IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which is the trade association of the world's largest airlines, was having its convention in Seattle around the same time as the festival was taking place. On the 6th of August, the hydroplane race was set to take place, and because of that, Boeing's chief test pilot, Alvin "Tex" Johnston, was asked to demonstrate the company's new prototype, the 367-80, or the Dash 80, which would later become the 707.
Boeing just happened to have a prototype airplane that was going to shrink the world by a factor of 2.
Johnston was told to just make a couple of passes over the race course in the lake before bringing the aircraft back home again, but he had some other plans. On his first pass, over an astonished crowd that included a lot of airline executives attending the IATA event, Johnston instead made a full barrel roll. As he later explained, he thought that any airline people watching this wouldn't believe their eyes, and he was right when he said that. After he'd done that first roll, he then made a 180-degree turn, came back around, and then repeated the same maneuver again over the now wildly cheering crowd. The legend goes that the next morning, Boeing's CEO called Johnston into his office and asked him, "What the hell are you doing?" And Johnston apparently just replied, "Selling airplanes." He also explained that the roll, when done right, was a constant 1G maneuver and that the aircraft was perfectly safe and never at any real risk. Now, some people might debate this, but his comment that he was selling airplanes had, well, plenty of truth to it. Because, believe it or not, before he did this stunt, nobody actually wanted to buy the 707. Now, normally, before an aircraft manufacturer decides to spend many millions or even billions of dollars to launch a new aircraft, they consult with a lot of many large airlines and leasing companies to see whether or not there is actually a market for the aircraft that they're planning to build, basically doing a little bit of market research. These discussions are normally really complicated and time-consuming because the priorities of different airlines around, for example, how far they are going to fly with the aircraft or what kind of airports that they typically want to operate in, tends to vary a little bit. So the aircraft manufacturer has to design an airliner that works well for as many of its customers as possible, or they have to design something that can be adapted in a few different ways, ensuring that all variants are competitive. This is a hugely complicated process, which often involves into a type of negotiation that can take years to go through. And as that's going on, the aircraft manufacturer also have to start talking to suppliers to make sure that they can actually get all of the parts that they need at the right specification and prices to start building the thing. So when Boeing decided to go ahead with the build of the Model 367-80, or the Dash 80 for short, how many orders do you think they had? 80? 50, maybe 20? Well, the actual answer was 0, meaning that Boeing had to dig deep into their own pockets to build this prototype without a single airline committing to any orders. But why didn't anyone want this plane, and how could Boeing take that risk and build it anyway? Well, it's actually easier to answer the second part of this question first. Basically, Boeing back then was a really bold company who believed in their own engineering abilities and in taking risks. And it also actually wasn't the first time that they had done something similar. Back in 1945, Boeing had decided to start the production of the Model 377 Stratocruiser, its last piston-engine airliner, and they geared up to make 50 of these aircraft before landing one single order. Boeing's CEO at the time, Bill Allen, really believed in the superiority of the design. His instinct paid off, with Pan American ordering 20 of these planes just weeks later, but the boldness of this decision actually was a little bit misleading. In reality, the 377 Stratocruiser was simply a variation of the military C-97 Stratofreighter, so Boeing could just reuse a lot of its existing tooling for the 377. This meant that going ahead with the production of a commercial 377 wasn't quite as bold or as risky as building the Dash 80 would later be. But to understand why the airlines didn't want a Boeing jetliner and why the company was bold enough to build it anyway, we have to backtrack a little further. But first, this. Are you a nervous flyer or just feel uncomfortable when you have to board an aircraft and have no one to ask questions to? I know that there are a lot of you out there, so I decided to do something about it. I have just released a new web-based app specifically made for you nervous flyers and aviation enthusiasts out there. Inside the app, we have a GPT-4 powered AI pilot named Aidan, who is specifically trained to answer any of the questions that you might have. He will always be there, always doing his best to patiently explain whatever concerns you might have, and I have personally trained him to be as accurate as the technology allows him to be. In the news section, you will get the latest news, and Aidan will be able to summarize and answer questions about the articles as well as translate them into any language. If you're going flying within the next 36 hours, the app will be able to tell you if the flight will be turbulent, when that turbulence might come, and also show you the route. You will then be able to ask Aidan about the flight, the aircraft you will be flying on, and what to do when you reach your destination. The app comes in light and dark mode as standard, and there are loads of special 360 videos where you can look around in the cockpit and see how we pilots fly certain procedures. I am also working on several videos specifically for nervous flyers, where I will be telling you what to think about, how to prepare, and what all of those different noises and sounds and sensations are while you're flying. The app is available right now, and there is no need to download it. Just go to app.mentorpilot.com and create a username. You can then add it to your home screen if you feel like it. It is absolutely free to use, but there is a subscription for those of you who are really taking it seriously and want access to all of the coolest features. Enjoy! Understanding the difficulties in the birth of the 707 actually brings us back to the de Havilland Comet. As I explained in the Comet video, Geoffrey de Havilland was basically the only one who believed in the future of jet-powered airliners at the time. Almost everyone else thought that they would be impossible to get commercially viable or have the range needed to be capable of crossing oceans. At that time, early in World War II, Boeing's management probably didn't think much of transatlantic jets either. But then, in 1943, Boeing started to work on a military bomber that would eventually become the B-47. Boeing, who were mainly known for their military aircraft back then, got a lot of experience from designing this jet bomber. Among other things, it helped Boeing to figure out the details like having the engines in pods under the wings, plus all of the system that a large jet needed, like the pressurization at higher altitude, for example. However, the turbojets that powered the B-47 suffered from quite a few immaturity problems. Remember, this was still in the very first decade of the jet age. The B-47 first flew in 1947, and by then Boeing was working on an even bigger bomber that would become the B-52 eventually. And that aircraft would enter service with 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines, which was a much more mature design than the engine that they had used on the B-47. Boeing knew that the J57 would be a much more suitable jet engine if they wanted to build a jet airliner later on. And sure enough, the civilian version of the J57 was developed and named the Pratt & Whitney JT3 Charlie, which would become the Boeing 707's first engine option. However, before this project could go ahead, Boeing obviously wanted to convince some airlines to buy it. But even in 1950, before the Comet's structural problems and other issues came to light, the airlines didn't really believe that they actually needed jet engine aircraft to carry passengers. Even though Boeing's 377 Stratocruiser had generally been well received, Boeing had only made 56 of them, just 6 more than the 50 they started building without any orders at all. At the time, Boeing was actually in 3rd place as a commercial aircraft maker behind both Douglas and Lockheed. Boeing's main competitor, especially for the commercial market, was Douglas, who had become really good at refining their family of radial piston engine-driven airliners. The legendary pre-war DC-3, which we'll definitely have a look at in a different video, had eventually led to a family of 4-engine aircraft, including the DC-4, the DC-6 and the DC-7. The problem that Boeing had in convincing the airlines that a jet would be financially viable was that it didn't really have a baseline of competitors or similar aircraft to compare to. In contrast, Douglas could, for example, promote the DC-6 or DC-7 by just comparing it to whichever previous version that the airline had already used. Remember, back in 1950, the only other jet that the airlines had heard of was the Comet, and as graceful as the Comet was, it could only carry a very small number of passengers, less than 50 in the first versions. This made its economics on many routes quite problematic and very hard to sell. Now, later versions would obviously get better engines and longer fuselages, enabling more passengers, but this was still years away at that point. After several studies using the B-47 and the B-52 as test aircraft, Boeing were pretty confident that an airliner with Pratt & Whitney JT3 Charlie turbojets would be a very financially viable aircraft. Each of these early turbojets produced about 10,000 pounds of thrust, and just to put that into perspective, this means that 4 of those engines created less thrust than the 2 CFM56 that we use on the 737 that I fly. Boeing also knew that they could give the plane a wing, in this case with a 35-degree sweep, that would make the Dash 80 faster than the de Havilland Comet and nearly twice as fast as any existing radial engine airliner that Douglas or Lockheed could offer. And speaking of speed, Boeing could also see another development which actually gave them that last bit of confidence that they needed in order to start building that first 707 prototype. Because remember the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser? Well, like I said before, this plane was a development of a military version called the C-97 and the KC-97 Stratofreighter. The KC variant was by far the most popular, with over 800 made, and it served as the aerial refueling tanker version. This plane entered service in 1951, but as it did, both Boeing and the US Air Force could see a problem, and that was that it was really slow. The KC-97 was basically a development of the World War II B-29 bomber. It had more powerful radial piston engines, and late versions even had a couple of turbojets to help it go a bit faster, but it was still really slow. This meant that refueling early fighter jets worked, but refueling newer, faster jets was becoming increasingly difficult. And on top of that, just the operation of the KC-97 was a bit messy. It needed aviation gasoline, or avgas, for its own piston engines, but obviously it also needed to carry jet fuel for the jet fighters it was refueling, and later also for its own 2 turbojets for the variants that were equipped with those. So this meant that it basically had 2 completely separate fuel systems. Boeing knew that the Air Force would eventually ask for a jet-powered air refueling tanker. This is where its gamble to build the 367-80 prototype actually started to make sense to them. But it was still a gamble because the Air Force had not started to look for a jet-powered tanker yet, so this was all built on the fact that Boeing certainly knew that they likely would. Boeing approved the plan to build the Dash 80 in 1952 in its Renton factory, the same place where it's currently making the 737s. The prototype was basically hand-built, and to save a bit of money, Boeing decided to use the same upper fuselage as the C-97 and the 377 had, enabling them to reuse some of their tooling. They managed to complete the build of the prototype in just 18 months, and their initial investment landed on $16 million, which in today's monetary value would be about $183 million. The first jet rolled out of its assembly building on the 14th of May 1954. And that was not good timing. About a month before that, a Comet 1 had suffered an explosive decompression over the Mediterranean, and this was after another comet had suffered the same fate in the previous January. And even before those tragedies, other comets had shown overstress damage and in one case crashed because of troublesome aerodynamics and also issues with its hydraulically powered flight control system. Clearly, this was not an ideal time to showcase a brand new, sleek passenger jet to the world, but Boeing did what they could. In their promotional videos, they emphasized the simplicity of the Dash 80, including its controls, which were not hydraulically powered, at least not to start with. The Dash 80 flew for the first time in July 1954, and immediately Boeing's decision to build it out of its own pocket started to pay off. Because later that same year, the Air Force finally did launch a competition for a jet-powered air refueling tanker. Boeing would end up competing against Lockheed in a race, and the winner eventually was Lockheed. Lockheed had proposed a design with rear-mounted engines, like those that could be seen on the French Caravelle, and they had called it the L193 Constellation II. But since Boeing's Dash 8 was already flying and Boeing could deliver it at least 2 years earlier, the US Air Force still decided to order 250 Boeing tankers that would be called the KC-135s. Lockheed actually ended up never building its L193, and that's because the Air Force was really happy with their KC-135s, and they didn't see the point of having two completely different tankers, so they just cancelled their Lockheed orders. So, sometimes it's better to be early than the best. Now, the KC-135 had a larger fuselage diameter than the prototype Dash 80 had by around 12 inches or 30.5 centimeters. That was enough for a 5-abreast passenger cabin, and that was the width that Boeing initially intended that the passenger 707 should have. But with the Air Force now waiting to get their KC-135 Stratotankers, Boeing still had to convince the airliners and the public about the merits of its 707 passenger jet, and that brings us back to that barrel roll in Seattle in August 1955. Remember, this was a year after the Comet explosive decompressions and many months after the causes of these tragedies were established and the reports were published. Boeing had in its marketing made sure to highlight the features of the 707 who made it radically different than the Comet. This included tear strips that would stop a surface tear from going further along its fuselage, and the use of thicker aluminium skins and structural ribs that were much closer together. But the problem is that technical descriptions like that just aren't really impressive. We humans are emotional creatures, meaning that the public, and probably some of the airline bosses as well, got a much better impression of the aircraft's robustness if they could see, for example, a barrel roll or two. I think that that's exactly what Tex Johnson thought of when he did those stunts, and it also seemed to actually work. About 2 months after those barrel rolls, Boeing received their first order for 20 707s from Pan Am. However, there were a few caveats in that first order. Firstly, Boeing would need to enlarge the fuselage of its plane again, because by this point, Douglas was busy working on its DC-8 to compete with Boeing, and the DC-8's fuselage was wide enough for 6 abreast seating. At the insistence of several airline bosses, especially Cyrus Rolett Smith of American Airlines, Boeing agreed to widen the 707 4 inches or 10 centimeters more than the KC-135, which just happened to also make it 1 inch wider than the DC-8. The other caveat in Pan Am's order for 20 planes was that the airline would also order 25 DC-8s, so at this point, in 1955, it was still definitely not clear if the 707 would be the eventual winner of the airline wars. The airlines were still hedging their bets at this point. But of course, the 707 did win. I can't really analyze the subsequent evolution and all of the versions of the 707 in this video because that would make it around 2 hours long at least. But Boeing made over 1,000 707s and separately over 800 KC-135s. The DC-8 also became quite successful, but to put it into perspective, Douglas still only made a total of 556 of them. The Dash 80 prototype also introduced a lot of different firsts in aviation. It was the first commercial aircraft to have a yaw damper, which was one of the systems that Boeing actually had adapted from the B-47 bomber, and initially they didn't fit that, but later they did to the 707. It also became the first airliner with plug-type doors, and initially the Dash 80 didn't use what is probably one of its most distinguishing characteristics, which is that antenna at the top of the vertical stabilizer. This was actually a high-frequency or shortwave antenna that was supposed to be used on ocean crossings where normal airband radios ran out of range. It's one of the few features on this marvel that just didn't quite catch on. Boeing also used the original 367-80 to test many other systems over the years, including a fifth tail-mounted engine for the 727. And by the way, if you have a link to or a picture of that plane in that configuration, can you please put it into the comments below? I'd love to see it. Other systems that were also tested on the Dash 80 included new wings, vertical and horizontal stabilizers, and many different engines and other systems before Boeing retired it back in 1969. Fortunately, it wasn't broken down for scrap. Instead, it spent the next few decades sunning itself in the desert before undergoing restoration in the 1990s. Now, this wasn't a perfect restoration to original condition, but to be fair, after so many changes over the years, this would have been literally impossible. It flew for the very last time in 2003 to go to Dulles International Airport near Washington, D.C., where it now sits on display in the Udvar-Hazy Center annex of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and you can still go and check it out today, which I highly recommend. What this plane is, without a question, is a testament to the legacy of Boeing as a bold engineering-led company that wasn't afraid to take big risks and be an industry leader, a role that I personally hope to see them take on again. Now, remember to check out my Teespring store, where we'll be featuring, among other things, the t-shirts of all of the classics that I'm talking about in this series. Any purchase greatly supports the channel, and if you want to be part of my real inner circle, then consider becoming a Patreon. Now, check out this video next, or maybe this playlist. And remember, if you're a nervous flyer or just interested in aviation in general, then go and check out my web app at app.mentorpilot.com. It's really cool. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.